Today has been a public relations man. He's been a journalist. He's been a newspaper publisher. Remember the Daily News? He's also been a chief of staff to one of our most prominent premiers. The list goes on, and of course we know him for his work directing the Gower Community Band for many, many years. It's my pleasure to welcome once again to the program Mr. Edsel Bonnell.
Thank you,
Edsel,
Karl.
I want to talk to you now about your public relations company. You were the first PR man, professional PR man in Newfoundland.
Yeah.
And your company was E.J. Bonnell Associates. Tell me about the kind of PR work you did and who were some of your clients?
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, I got into it as a result of my work in the IWA strike. And there was the A&D company became very aware of what they had been lacking and so on and so forth, and they turned over a new leaf to make things better. So anyway, they were looking for somebody who had experience and all that kind of stuff. A man by the name of Ewart Young. I don't know if you remember Ewart, the late Ewart Young. He was the founder, I guess. Yeah, yes, the founder, and of course the manager and owner of the Atlantic Guardian and the Guardian Press, where I used to get my magazine published and so on. And he had contacts in Montreal and Toronto, professional PR people, okay? And he, with them, he asked me, would I go to work? And I said, well, you know, at that time in the media, I was almost like selling out your soul, but I was so involved, I guess, in what had happened in IWA. And the A&D was, you know, vowing to rebuild all of the woods camps and so on. And so I said yes, and we went out there. They were our first client, and went out there and did that. I mean,
we should explain that the A&D company stands for Anglo Newfoundland
Development Company. I must say, and young people would remember that.
They ran the logging industry and the mill.
And the mill in Grand Falls.
Grand Falls.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And which was really the heart of the strike. And there was no really strike out in Borders because they were sort of cute. They said, we don't have any loggers. What they did, they had logging contractors, and they just hired them to deliver the wood, and the contractors had to pay the loggers. Anyway, but that's another thing. Anyway, but I went in and I fell in love with it. It was a whole new era of communications. And I also felt that it was going to be a very big industry in the future, which it became. But at that time, it was really tough, really hard. But Ewart and I started an outfit called Newfoundland Public Relations Company Limited. And but then Ewart got ill and so on and so forth, and that was falling apart, and so I went out on my own, and you know, and told Ewart we sort of had a little different divergence of opinion on the way things should go, but I went out on my own anyway, and it did very well. But you were a pioneer in PR counseling in Newfoundland. Now there were other people here like. People who worked for tourism or fisheries, Doug Wheeler, tourism, and Mark Ronayne in fisheries and so on and so forth, federal fisheries. But they were media relations people. They weren't public relations counselors. And in those days, the public relations man was never sort of in the head office or at the boardroom table. You know, he just looked after the media. Well, that was going to change, and it has changed, and for the better. And now exactly that dream has come true, and the public relations people are valued and are, you know, vice presidents and so on of large corporations. Anyway, But we got into it, and I E.J. Bonnell Associates first, and then for various reasons, it morphed into later in life Bonnell Public Relations, which is, I still have it now, but although it's not active.
Now, after public relations, you decide to get into publishing,
Yeah.
and you took on the Daily News, which was a daily newspaper. It came out in the morning, right?
1968.
Why did you do that?
Well, because for two reasons. Even when I worked at the Telegram, I always had the sense that the future of newspaper publishing was going to be with morning newspapers. It really did. Took a long while to catch on in Newfoundland because people were embedded with the Telegram. But that's exactly what the Telegram is now. Mm. You get it, I get it in it's in my mailbox before I get up, you know? And so I like the concept. In the meantime, the Currys, who owned Daily News, were giving it up. I mean, they were, you know, they were no match for the Telegram, that's for sure. And but the Crosby group of companies were interested in you know, buying them out, okay, which they did, and they hired George Ferlin. You may know George, Dr. George Ferlin, at Queen's University. But he had been a newsman here in my day and so on and so forth. And they persuaded him to come back and bring in a whole different approach and so on and so forth, offset printing and all the rest of it, and to see if we could build a newspaper empire, which they did. Which became the Robinson Blackmore, because Robinson Company was the publisher's Daily News, and then the Blackmore Printing in Grand Falls, and it became a very viable concern. But George asked me, he was the publisher and so on, and he asked me would I, he's an old friend of mine, he asked me would I go down as managing editor. And again, I couldn't resist it, you know, and I was doing okay in the PR, but I couldn't resist it, and I said yes. So I went down there, and then I was there in '68, and I was there for 3 years. George went back to Queens in 1969, I think it was, and the owners, you know, the board of Robinson Blackmore, asked me would I stay on as publisher. That's when I became a publisher, which I did. And we hired other people. Phil Curry became managing editor and so on. But we had some wonderful times. I got papers home now. We did everything. We instituted a Sunday paper, Sunday edition. We instituted with the Office of Press, we instituted color comics, our own color comics. And the late, great Ted Mills, he actually did a Newfoundland comic called The Fishers of Bay Cove. And they were incredible. And he used all our faces, by the way, as the cartoon characters. It was incredible. We had so much fun and so much, you know, energy and everything else. But it was a hard press. And I was involved, you know, I had indentured some of my own, you know, assets. Like, I mean, if anything went well, if it went wrong, if anybody closed up, you know, and I'd be out, I'd lose the house and everything. So, you know, so finally I had an opportunity came by when, because as it happens, the government changed in 1971, provincial government, and Jim Toms and Bill Callahan. Of course, Bill was a minister, and Jim Toms was in charge of the old government paper, okay? And they were out of work because Frank Morris had taken over as a PC premier. And they were looking for something themselves, and they formed a company and made an offer. And I sold out my interest, which also included the Bureau Peninsula Post and a paper called the Free Press, which was mass delivery in St. John's. And I got my life back. I went back into PR and got my life back, at least for a while. And but it was an incredibly exciting adventure. I'm glad I did it.
Let's move ahead and talk
Yeah.
about politics.
Okay.
How did you end up becoming the chief of staff for Premier Clyde Wells
Yeah.
and his senior policy advisor? How did that come about?
Good Friday in 1987. I had a call from, never forget Good Friday because I had a call from Clyde Wells. And he told me he had decided to enter the leadership for the Liberal Party, leadership, for the leader of the Liberal Party, leader. And I said, good for you, good luck. I knew him. Good luck to you. You're going to give up your law practice. He had the most successful law practice in Newfoundland, and, you know. Anyway, he said, yeah, well, you know, yes, but we'll find a way to do that. I said, okay. He said, would you do my, you know, PR for my leadership convention? I said, well, I don't think so. I said, I've had a lot of trouble with politics before, and especially with in election campaigns that you never got paid for and stuff like that. I said, I don't think so. He said, well, he's a very determined man. He said, will you come and talk to me anyway? So I said, okay. So I went in on Saturday or Easter Sunday, I believe it was, and I had a long talk with him. Out of that talk, I decided I would do it. I liked what I saw, I liked what I heard, and I felt that Newfoundland needed Clyde Wells at that time. So I took it on, and his leadership campaign was very successful, and he won it. That fall, he had to get a seat in the House of Assembly, so he came to me again and said, will you look after my campaign and wins or buckles? I said, well, I know I got a lot of work to do. No, he was very persuasive. And anyway, I did that. And after that, he was in the House, and then the House of Assembly, and he was, of course, the leader of the opposition. And that's when it started. And he wouldn't let up. And he wanted me to go in as chief of staff of the opposition. And I said, I can't afford it, because there was no such job. And I said, finally, I kept at it. And finally, I said, well, look, I'll tell you what. If you can find a reasonable salary, I'll say yes. Thinking he never could get the Pickford government at that time to have a chief. They didn't have a chief of staff in the opposition. Somehow he did it. He cobbled together a whole bunch of posts, and I got in there. I went in there. Anyway, from then on, it came then. After that moved in. Then we had the election in 1989, which we, Liberals, won, handily won. And so then, I was still chief of staff of the opposition. We moved up to chief of staff of the government, of the Premier's office. And that's how I got that, but through steps. I actually, it sounds very august. I don't use it at all, but actually, when I went into the chief of staff's office in the Premier's office, the previous government had 3 posts there: chief of staff, they had principal secretary, and senior policy advisor. We were bound by Clyde Wells' policy that when we got in, we were going to be mean and lean, okay? So we had to start cutting back. First thing I did was cut back all that. So we rolled those three titles into one, which was chief of staff, which is the way it should be, and I only had 1 salary. So we did away with 2 salaries.
What, as chief of staff, what did you do? What was your job?
Well, if you, the best way to answer that question without going into a long harangue is that all you have to do is look at the chiefs of staff of President Biden right at the moment, or Prime Minister Trudeau, or whatever. It's a very key position because you are the Premier's closest confidant, non-political confidant, okay? And you're there, and you are an advisor, but it's not so much a senior advisor, but I didn't develop policy or anything like that. That's up to the Premier and his cabinet departments and so on. But it was almost like the sort of like the Senate, you know, the sober second look or whatever. But my job was to advise the Premier on all the other advice he was getting, okay? And sort of synthesize it, the good and the bad, and add my own perspective, offer to him, which he would either take or not. Mostly he would, because we had a great relationship and so on and so forth. And he trusted me and I trusted him, and that's the way it went. So it was interesting.
Were you, in a sense, a gatekeeper as well? Did you control who got to see the Premier and who didn't get to see the Premier?
Well, we had for regular appointments, we had an appointment secretary, and she looked after all that. But in terms of shielding the Premier, sort of thing, for a lot of things that he should be shielded from, yes. And that's part of the any chief of staff. Chief of staff is a tough job. I remember at the time I read a book about it back in the 1980s, and chiefs of staff in America and Canada and all the rest of it, they don't last long. I remember Prime Minister Trump. I think he went through a dozen in the 4 years he was there.
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
and you know it's a tough job. I lasted, including opposition, I lasted for 8 years, so which was unique.
You were chief of staff, obviously, during the Meech Lake period.
Yes.
And Clyde Wells became like a national celebrity during the Meech Lake.
A celebrity and a hero.
A celebrity,
to everybody
hero.
Except those in Quebec.
Now, I'm just wondering, as chief of staff, you must have had to deal with all kinds of incoming requests from people for meetings, media requests for interviews from all across the country. Was it like a wild and crazy period?
It was, but not so much for that, because of course we did have a communications director, Judy Foote, who's now lieutenant governor, okay, and she handled all the media, every bit of it. And as I say, for other people, her appointment secretary looked at it. It wasn't so much for appointments, but it was a wild experience, and there were a lot going on behind the scenes, and the Premier's meetings and so on that I had to be involved in and attend, and all the rest of it, and also I had to look after the Premier and all the rest of it. Give you an example. We had in the peak period of Meech Lake, we had 30,000 letters coming from across Canada, and well over 90% positive. I mean, he was a hero, but then there was a lot of negatives, and in the negatives there would be. I had a drawer full of death threats, okay, and sincere death threats. And so with that, I made sure I didn't bother I would tell the telegram, I would tell the Premier that, yes, we got, a few threats, but don't worry about it, we're looking after it. And I worked closely, for example, with the head of the RCMP here and the head of the RNC. And every threat went through them, and it's amazing what they could do. And in fact, Clyde Wells, he was still speaking on the mainland and speaking here and going out in public. But there was a lot of bad people out there. But he never spoke anywhere, never did anything without a couple of plainclothesmen being very, very close. He didn't even know they were there, okay? But that's the way it was, including on the mainland. But things like that, it was an exciting time. But again, a very tiring time. It was 24/7. And virtually, I mean, you couldn't get home to sleep hardly,
What kind of a boss was Clyde Wells?
Demanding. He has every right to be demanding. But Clyde Wells is a unique man. He was the only, when I say was, he's not premier anymore. He was the only premier of Newfoundland who was completely apolitical. He was an political. How can you do that? And he did, and he stayed above it all. He never got down into what they used to call the trenches, you know, of all the chicanery and duplicity and the wheeling and dealing that goes on in politics, and it goes on everywhere, you know, and worse anywhere else than now, like what you're starting to see, the lies, the duplicity down in the southern states right now. It's just unbelievable. It's sickening. But Clyde Wells stayed above all that. He operated on a different plane, on his own policies, and making Newfoundland, you know, an economic entity. And you know, when we started in the first year, like I said, we cut down the Premier's office, and he was determined to do what no other Premier had done since Confederation, have a balanced budget. Everybody ran millions of dollars a year from Joe Smallwood on, millions of dollars, up to billions now. And but we finally made it. But we cut back. I mean, we had 3,000 public servants, you know, served positions, not always people, but positions were done away with, and things like that. We took 2 or 3 strikes, you know, the public service and teachers, nurses, and all the rest was Clyde Lloyd. Remember all these? Oh, it was horrendous, and he just kept going through it all, and we did Meech Lake and all in the middle of all that. In the meantime, same time, we lost the fishery in 1992. 91, 92. I mean, that was closed up, our biggest industry, you know, and there was a racket over that, and all the rest of it. And yet he managed. I chaired the committee for the economic planning group, which developed the economic plan, and also did another one then, or for a strategic social plan. Now, you know, and in the middle of all that, and then we finally made it. In 1995, the budget of 1995, 96, we actually were the first provincial government to actually balance the budget. It's unbelievable, you know, and it didn't happen after that until the royalties started rolling in from Hibernia, and back in, 2005, 2006, around there.
So Edsel, I have one final question for you, and of course it has to be about the Gower Community Band. When you took
My favorite subject.
Yes, when you took it over, it became a community band. Now just explain what that means and where you found all of these young people who became members of the band.
Well, as I said, as I recall, I was asked to take over the Gower Street United Church Youth Band. Okay, there was virtually nothing there, and I went down, but there was a lot of promise there, and I said, I finally told the church I would take it over on really one condition, and they said what? And I said that it not be a church band anymore. I said we'll drop the United Church, Gower United Church, and just be the Gower Youth Band. And I said, that way we'll turn it into a community band, which is an outreach of the church instead of an inreach. That was the big difference. And they agreed to it. And they had put a fair amount of funding into it by that time. And anyway, it went from there. It started on Halloween night in 1973 as my first full-time practice with them. And the 3 people turned up. And but those 3 people were the most exciting people that I had ever met, because they're 3 young boys, but they were excited. All they wanted to do was learn music and play music. And I had gone over that concept with them, and they said, great, we'll go out and get people to come, and they did. And the next week we had I think 16 or something, and before you know, we're up to a band of 20 or something, and it went from there. And it's been an absolute, well, it's nationally known and internationally known for what it turned into. And it was just wonderful. That was the Gower Youth Band, and that proceeded until the 2000, around the turn of the century, and things had changed a lot. We weren't, the emphasis was not so much. There was all kinds of things for youth to do, schools and all the rest of it. Education had changed, so we decided it should be intergenerational. And with my son John, in fact, he was instrumental in getting an alumni group of the Gower Youth Band, who were now no longer eligible because of their age, and they started an alumni band called the Gower Community Band.
Yeah.
Eventually, that became an intergenerational band, and that's what it is to this day, and Gower Community Band.
Every accolade you've ever received for your work with the band has been most deserved, and every accolade you've received for everything you've done in your life is well deserved. Thanks so much, Edsel Bonnell, for being with us.
Well, can I say one other thing? Whatever accolades I got for the band, and in fact for everything else, I have to share it. Because I've often said on many stages, as far as the community band is concerned, it would not have happened without my partner in life, my Anthea, beloved Anthea, and she was the heart and soul of that band. And in fact, there's a plaque to that memory down in our street, United Church today.
Lovely way to end the program. Thank you, Edsel. And that's it for this edition of Karl Wells' Point to Point. Thank you for watching. See you again next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for a variety of products, home-style breads, sandwiches, plus check out our freshly baked artisan breads and single-serve desserts exclusively at our in-store bakery on Frecker Drive. With 25 locations, wherever you go, there we are.
If you have a comment about this